Imagination is an inseparable part of our humanity. It's part of the way in which we distance ourselves from ourselves a bit, learn about ourselves as if we were something else.
Being able to talk through metaphors, being able to talk through analogies, and then take the big ideas from that and apply them back to our lives.
Some religious faiths have been, you might say, at war with the imagination, have been very suspicious of the way in which images, and particularly myths and legends and stories, might possibly delude us.
Fantasy requires you to accept the existence of other realities, other worlds, provides an opportunity for spiritual themes to be explored.
Certainly the classic works of fantasy, the Tolkienian, C.S. Lewis fantasy, and then a lot of modern fantasy, it's rooted in the idea that there is a spiritual battle, a spiritual world. It all involve that sense of a cosmic conflict, of the reality of invisible forces, of things that can't be explained by the laws of science and the laws of physics.
It's that spiritual element that make the stories of Narnia and Middle-earth not just bestsellers, but cultural phenomena that continue to this day.
It is a remarkable thing that some of the very best, purely imaginative literature, if you like, fantasy literature, has actually been written by Christians.
The Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College, Illinois, is a unique research archive dedicated to collecting materials from 7 imaginative Christian authors. While it may seem like an unlikely place for fans of the fantasy genre to add to their bucket list, artifacts include the desk upon which J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. And not only does the center have the desk that the Chronicles of Narnia were written on, but the very wardrobe that C.S. Lewis and his brother Warnie played in as children. But there is another fantasy maker in this group. While his name has faded over time, his impact on the genre is indisputable. Known as the master of fairy, and considered by many the father of modern fantasy, George MacDonald's story is connected and intertwined with both Lewis and Tolkien. These 3 pioneered the fantasy genre with their imaginations and changed the world through hobbits, goblins, and talking lions. The story begins in the south of England in 1850 with a young minister facing a hostile congregation.
When I was 6 or 7, somebody said to me, "Oh, if you like Narnia, you'll like these books about a princess by a man named George MacDonald." So I was given The Princess and the Goblin, Princess and Curdie. And I read those and fell in love with them and read them and reread them many times. It was really intriguing for me, again, reading the very little biographical information there was available on MacDonald, and I kept on reading about this minister who'd lost his job because some people in his congregation didn't like what he said, and then had to write novels to support his family. And that's sort of the usual story of who MacDonald is and what he did. I did primary research and reading through MacDonald's letters. There are hordes of letters in the Bonnecke Library and diaries of his children, and became more and more intrigued by this man for whom story was not just a means of communication, but a means of potential transformation. Growing up in Scotland immediately gave MacDonald a storied advantage that growing up in England would not have given him.
England was the head of an expanding empire, and also in the middle of an industrial revolution. As society transformed, many of its stories and folklore would be forgotten.
Victorian England, they are the richest, they are the most powerful, they are kind of the undisputed masters of the world at this point in time. The Victorians were very serious underneath. Discussions about morals and a lot of discussion about respectability and religion. So with the Industrial Revolution occurring, there was changing conditions, people moving from rural locations to urban locations.
Swarming in from all over the place, and so they weren't in their communities anymore. The lower classes were mostly, they were illiterate, uneducated, In Scotland, education was available in every parish school. So MacDonald has an education, even though he's from a farm family.
MacDonald was brought up in a really quite fierce and suspicious kind of ultra-Protestant Calvinism. In one of his stories, there's a gifted lad playing the fiddle and his grandmother makes him burn it, because it's the devil's thing and it's music. And he lived in the kind of church where the kirk, had no graven image anywhere, no picture, no illustration.
He had a fundamentalist Calvinistic grandmother who was not comfortable with stories, but that was his grandmother. And he didn't live with his grandmother. He lived with his father and his uncle. His mother died when he was younger, who not only read voraciously themselves everything from Cooper's poetry to Milton to Spencer to Coleridge to contemporary things like Darwin's Beagle. So he actually had a really rich background of folk tales, of fairy tales, of family history, of literary history, of Bible stories. Stories of MacDonald at the age of 13 standing on the table and regaling the farm staff with sermons and Bible stories.
There was a contradiction there, that particular form of hyper-Calvinism in Scotland was always a strange cross in that the Scottish people, their whole tradition is full of story and myth and image, and there was always a bit of a war, if you like, in each Protestant Scot between Christ and culture.
He goes off to university in Aberdeen, is actually passionate about mathematics, physics. That's what he wants to become, is a scientist. But his family can't afford to send him. So he goes down to London to do some tutoring, kind of at loose ends, and somebody says, well, why don't you go off to seminary? But he starts going to the lectures of a man named A.J. Scott. And A.J. Scott is a Scottish minister who's come down to London as a preacher, but was really shocked at how unstoried the urban Londonites around him were. We are a storied people. And particularly for him theologically, it's very important that we know our stories, not just our Bible stories, but our stories all the way through who we are. There were 2 universities at the time, Oxford and Cambridge, that was it. Literature was not taught in the universities. And Scott was discovering that not only the uneducated people around him in his church, in his congregation, but also his educated friends, they had no clue who Beowulf was. They'd never read Chaucer, they'd never read Shakespeare, the Arthurian story, medieval stories. People have forgotten those. And so he became very passionate about restoring London. And so he begins to give lectures down on the docks to the dock workers. He gives lectures in the lecturing halls to the upper classes and starts telling them about Beowulf and about King Alfred translating works into English so the English could read their own stories. This is a Scot restoring the English, and people love it. MacDonald starts attending these lectures. He decides this is what he wants to do himself. And so he graduates from seminary. He goes off to this church, and he actually writes to his brother when he goes off to the church saying, I'm here for now, but what I really want to do is write.
He already has a lot of original ideas that are somewhat controversial. He loved German writers, and so he read the German Romantics in particular, so people like Novalis and Goethe and Schiller and all the rest of them, and that influenced his way of thinking about things. And now, what he challenged was the doctrine basically of damnation, and he implied a kind of universalism.
MacDonald's sermons focused on God's universal love and suggested the possibility that all might be redeemed when sin and death are forever vanquished.
I mean, he took sin seriously, but he also took grace so seriously that he believed in the end that grace would always soften and overcome and redeem sin. And that generous message, paradoxically, got him into trouble. He published famously the beautiful unspoken sermons, and they were unspoken because he wasn't allowed to speak them.
And so to read someone here, who's struggling with issues of hell and eternal torment, and he's writing sermons about this, and I'm going, here is a man who is struggling with these issues, these deep, profound theological issues, and he's not afraid to talk about them in a pulpit.
They didn't officially fire him, they just reduced his salary to the point that he couldn't stay. Just when he was getting married, just when he's starting to have children, kind of when he needs a little bit of stability and security.
Leaving the church in Arundel, the MacDonald family would move to Hastings on the coast of southern England. This is where MacDonald, with the ideas of A.J. Scott still in mind, would begin his first fairy tale.
Mallory's text hadn't been published since like the 1600s with the Arthurian stories. But when Scott and his fellow medievalists start bringing these stories up, people get really excited. They start to latch onto it and almost becomes part of the English identity all of a sudden. There's knights everywhere, knights in shining armor all over the place. But he's also feeling like they're kind of starting to miss what those stories are about. It's just become a fad. It's sort of like Twilight or The Walking Dead. It's become fadism. They're talking about the stories, but they're actually not dwelling in the stories and receiving what they could from the stories. And so he writes the first ever work of fantasy in English for the modern era. He beats Tennyson to the mark with Arthurian references in it. The story of Fantastes, which, as you know, becomes a very key theme in fantasy work from then until now.
The day before had been my 120th birthday. Among other ceremonies investing me with my legal rights, the keys of an old secretary, in which my father had kept his private papers, had been delivered up to me.
The theme is the journey of transformation. You've got a character, Anados, who's taking possession of his inheritance, and he's sort of figuring out what it means to be an adult.
Who wants to be a knight, who wants to be chivalric. And when he falls asleep and wakes up in the morning, he finds himself in fairyland. He's left his primary world. He's woken up in the secondary world. And in that secondary world, he has to figure out what it truly means to be a knight.
You see, this fairyland is full of oddities and all sorts of incredibly ridiculous things, which a man is compelled to meet and treat as real existences, although all the time he feels foolish for doing so.
And at one point in time, he actually stops and pauses and rests in a fairy palace with a library and starts to read other stories. And as he's reading these other stories, these books, he says, very self-consciously, I entered that tale. I experienced what the protagonist experienced, and I learned.
It ends up being the story of his loss of pride, loss of self, loss of kind of the shadowy underside of his soul, this self-sacrifice, this dying to self.
So in this story, MacDonald is constantly pulling in images and stories from English stories, but also from German fairy tales, Dantean images, weaving these all together, all these different stories that shape the story of Anados. And so when he returns to his primary world, to England, from fairyland, he says,
And I began the duties of my new position somewhat instructed, I hoped, by the adventures that had befallen me in fairyland. Could I translate the experience of my travels there into common life? This was the question.
The response to Fantastes is huge. Young people especially love the book. It is the Harry Potter of its day. So he helps forge fantasy in the modern era.
To make friends with the imagination and to realize that the imagination was God-given. Of course it had its shadow side, but that it could be given back to the spirit, and that the light which lightens everyone who comes into the world was not just the light of reason and strict logical syllogistic theology, but was also the light of story and the light of poetry and the light of myth.
I really like his essays on what he was attempting to do and why it was important. Linking, which Tolkien would do in On Fairy Stories, but MacDonald did it in a very, very elegant way, imagining that to come. Linking the faculty of rationality with imagination. That imagination allows us to think. It's a way of thinking. It's not this irrational, whimsical divorce from rationality or reasonableness. It's not something that we do in lieu of deep examining thought. It's actually a way we have deep examining thought.
The greatest forces lie in the region of the uncomprehended. A fairy tale, a sonata, a gathering storm, a limitless night seizes you and sweeps you away.
giving you an alternate experience of time and of space. And this is one of the reasons why I think fantasy in the Victorian and the modern age is so powerful, is because people have become so accustomed to everyday, mundane time that just extends. And the same thing with space. Victorian period in particular, they're starting to deal with a lot more urban settings. They're living in close, cramped kind of quarters and maybe not always aesthetically pleasing, and pollution and all the rest of it. Fairy tales open up kind of an ideal space, but also a place where people can imaginatively explore.
Now an established writer with the success of Phantastes, MacDonald would continue to support his wife Louisa and growing family with his writing. It would include poetry, adult fiction, and theological writing.
So his novels tend to be a bit lengthy, and they are great, but they're not traditional novels. There are sermons in there. There are kind of stories that he throws into his novels, and it's kind of all mixed up. So it's harder for people to kind of know what to do with the novels. Whereas the fairy tales, he actually does kind of very precisely. They weren't kind of churned out, for monetary gain. They seem to kind of appear when he has this brilliant vision, powerful images, or a twist on a traditional fairy tale.
Now, the Golden Key, a lot of people would very easily say that's George MacDonald's best fairy tale. Tolkien references it in his essay on fairy tales, and so that's part of the reason why people are aware of it.
There was a boy who used to sit in the twilight and listen to his great-aunt's stories.
MacDonald's fairy tales in particular, he loves images of twilight. It's neither this nor that. We're not fully in night, we're not fully in day. We're in this in-between kind of space where things can transform, where a flower could be a fairy, and where the possible becomes the real, to use MacDonald's phrase.
She told him that if he could reach the place where the end of the rainbow stands, he would find there a golden key. "What is the key for?" the boy would ask. "What is it the key of? What will it open?" "Nobody knows," his aunt would reply. "He has to find that out."
It is a beautiful tale, it's a profound tale, and it's an incredibly difficult tale to completely unpick, which is a good thing.
All that his great-aunt told the boy about the golden key would have been nonsense, had it not been that their little house stood on the borders of fairyland.
Twilight is, of course, a borderland and a hinterland where day meets night. I mean, I think all storytellers, and particularly those concerned with, if you like, numinous or poetically resonant story, are interested in borders and hinterlands, in the places where apparent opposites meet, day and night, time and eternity, our world and another one.
But in fairyland, it is quite different. Things that look real in this country look very thin indeed in fairyland.
When MacDonald talks about fairy tales, more should always be meant that meets the ear. And The Golden Key is a wonderful example of a tale that has much more in it than meets the ear.
He writes a brilliant essay called The Fantastic Imagination, and he refuses in that to define a fairy tale. And I think the reason why is because he feels like part of the way it functions is by making the reader engage with it on their own level. That if your idea for the symbolism of the golden key or a rainbow or whatever it happens to be is different from mine, that's okay. And in fact, that's what I want.
"You have tasted of death now," said the old man. "Is it good?" "It is good," said Mossy. "It is better than life." "No," said the old man. "It is only more life."
As MacDonald continued to write through the middle of the 19th century, his growing list of literary friends would include Walt Whitman, Henry Longfellow, and even Mark Twain. But most notably was a young Victorian photographer that also enjoyed creating children's stories. His name was Charles Dodgson, but he would adopt the pen name of Lewis Carroll.
He, of course, influences all the people in the Victorian period, Lewis Carroll being the most significant. Lewis Carroll showed him the manuscripts for Alice in Wonderland. George MacDonald's children, they're kind of like the first audience. And it was George MacDonald in particular who strongly recommended that he publish. Alice in Wonderland comes out after MacDonald has already published and done a lot of his writing, and they were good friends and, of course, influenced each other when they were both writing their greatest works of fantasy.
If you think about making any kind of imaginative work, in the end it's a kind of, I mean, I've just used the word work, but I could equally use the word play. It is a kind of playfulness. You have to be playful in some way. I mean, obviously Shakespeare wrote plays, there's a sense of playfulness. So the notion of play and of children playing, the root, if you like, of all kinds of it, is the kind of the lightness and the easiness and the sheer doing it for fun that children have when they play.
It was so important because the Victorians were so serious, and because they needed a bit of lightness, they needed a bit of relief. They give adults and children permission to play, permission to not take things seriously. And I think for MacDonald, they particularly needed it spiritually and intellectually and imaginative.
There was once a little princess whose father was king over a great country full of mountains and valleys. The princess, whose name was Irene, was to be brought up by country people in a large house, half castle, half farmhouse.
An aristocrat, sort of the ruling class, and you've got Curdy the miner. MacDonald frequently liked was these different class kind of interactions between his main characters.
Ring, dod, bang, go the hammers clang. Thus we rive the rocks, force the goblin locks. Now let's run, said the nurse. No, no, said the little miner. That's the worst thing you can do. If you're not afraid of them, they're afraid of you.
What is it about not fearing faith, trusting imagination?
One of the key aspects of that is the discovery of the grandmother who lives in the attic of the castle where she's living, and she's kind of the fairy helper figure within the story.
Having already read C.S. Lewis, having already read Tolkien, it just seemed so normal. It seemed so natural, and I realized that's what everything else evolved out of.
He was at the entrance of a magnificent cavern, now the great palace hall of the goblins. The king had been making them a speech, and the applause which followed it was what Curdy had heard.
So here's a guy who lived 1850s, and yet I can still take that story and tell it to my kids. It was just beautiful to do that and to see that.
When I was 6 years old, I remember sitting in church, listening to the minister read from Isaiah 6. And I sat there going, oh, that's from The Princess and Curdy. And it actually took me a few years before I realized it was the other way around, that when the great-grandmother says to Curdy, will you go where I'm sending you, even though you don't know what the mission is? And Curdy says, here I am, send me. And he puts his hands into the roses. When I was in grad school, I was doing a course on Isaiah, and I was kind of reminded, I was reading through, I was like, oh yeah, here's the Curdy passage. And in the darkness, there shall be a great light. Wow, that's kind of like Curdy and his dad in the mines, isn't it? Cloud of doves, thousands against one on the battlefield. And when you start reading the two next to each other, you see the conversation of stories that is happening in a way that's quite stunning and striking. The reason his imagination was so rich and full was because he was engaging, he was relating with the imaginations of those who came before very intentionally, all the way back to scripture and before that.
In 1895, MacDonald's final fairy tale would be Lilith, a romance. 10 years later, the imaginative writer would pass away.
MacDonald did almost fade away, particularly his adult novels, but also his essays and sermons.
In his own time, he was a bit overshadowed by Lewis Carroll and by J.M. Barrie with Peter Pan a little bit later on. And MacDonald is an odd thing, and all the different aspects and all the different sides to him. There's the Victorian style to MacDonald that can become difficult. The image of him as a preacher.
Moving on into the early 20th century, people did not want books that had sermons in them. The only people that were really engaging with MacDonald were literary critics, the Jungians, the Freudian literary critics, because they got excited because here was somebody who had female role models discussing the importance of dreams, who was using symbolism left, right, and center, and so that was exciting for them. But what many of them failed to realize was MacDonald's precedence for that, which was participating in a Christian literary tradition.
They climbed out of the earth, and still climbing rose above it. They were in the rainbow, Far abroad, over ocean and land, stairs beside stairs wound up together, and beautiful beings of all ages climbed along with them. They knew that they were going up to the country whence the shadows fall.
The endless ending kind of provokes you to think about, well, what happens next? Hopefully, I think for MacDonald, to take some of that into their own lives, to let the story carry on in their thinking.
While MacDonald's name would fade, his story does not end. His fairy tales would go on to inspire the two great fantasy makers of the 20th century. For fantasy literature, 1954 was a hugely significant year. Almost 100 years since George MacDonald had penned Fantastes, there would not be one but two major fantasy works on the bookshelves in England. At the University of Oxford, Professor John Ronald Reuel Tolkien would release the long-expected publication of The Fellowship of the Ring, the first of a set of three, set in Tolkien's world of Middle-earth, making up the Lord of the Rings, which would be published over the next 2 years. A train ride away at Cambridge University was his longtime friend and new chair of medieval and Renaissance literature, Clive Staples Lewis. Lewis himself was completing the Narnia series, a 7-book collection that had begun with the fantastically successful The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Like MacDonald, Tolkien and Lewis, one Catholic and the other Anglican, saw their faith as integral to their works of fantasy.
In some ways, they felt themselves to be outsiders in the literary world, but outsiders who had taken the old folk tales and the old medieval legends and the old medieval poems and creating new works of literature out of them.
Born in South Africa, Tolkien had lost his father when he was just 3 years old and would move to England with his mother and younger brother. He would not only become a voracious reader at a young age, but write his first fantasy story.
So Tolkien was of a generation that was brought up with adventure stories. So he read about the Old Norse stories, the gods Thor and Odin and so on. And he also read some of the sort of fantasy books that were around at the time, like William Morris and George MacDonald.
Tolkien, when he was a young boy, wrote a story which he called The Green Great Dragon.
Don't we all create fantasy stories when we're small? Maybe all medievalists do. Because all the best stories were quasi-medieval, about dragons and things, and not about Peter and John going shopping with Mummy.
I mean, dragons make for great stories. They're beautiful, they're majestic, I mean, they're colorful, but they're also powerful. And in some stories, in the Western world, they embody pure evil.
And they're sort of everybody's nightmare. That are unpredictable. They fly in and then fly off again, and maybe eat a few people along the way.
And then you add fire. Fire is your friend. You need fire. Without fire, we wouldn't have become who we are. But fire is terrible and destructive. Fire in the scripture is an image both of hell and of God. Our God is a consuming fire, and yet we speak of the flames of hell and a lake of eternal fire. So the idea of seeing what is attractive, but also slaying what is evil, is all bound up in the story of dragons.
And his mother apparently corrected him and said that actually you should say the Great Green Dragon. And Tolkien, about the age of 5 or 6, started to wonder why you cannot say Great Green Dragon, you have to say Green Great Dragon. It's something about the way the English language works. So he says that this was one of the moments where he became interested in languages.
Tolkien's life would profoundly change at the age of 12 with the death of his mother. He and his brother would be left to a father, Francis Xavier Morgan, who would become their guardian. This would profoundly shape Tolkien's spiritual and academic life forward, leading the young man all the way to Oxford University.
He was obviously schooled a bit in Latin and picked up a bit of Greek, but what really intrigued him were the old Germanic languages like Gothic, Old English, and so on. And the two began to coincide. He read the original stories in the original languages and gradually took that forward at school and at university.
And he started to design his own languages based on the languages he knew. But he thought I suppose that every language had a worldview attached to it.
And he needed a mythology, if you like, to let his language live in. So Middle-earth, which is mid in J.R.R, it's a common term in Old English and Old Norse, begins to form around the time when he's just leaving university, about to join the army in the First World War. It was all triggered in many ways by trying to answer questions. So there is a very famous poem in Old English called Christ, and in it, it mentions this Old English word Earendel, which no one really knows what it is. It's some sort of star.
Hail, Earendel, brightest of angels, above the middle earth, and true radiance of the sun.
Hail, Earendel, Engla Beatus. It is a poem about the advent of Christ. It's a Christian religious poem, but he imagines that Earendel must go way back into pre-Christian time.
And from there he started to write and begin to develop this mythology, particularly a tale around Earendel the voyager, which then become quite ingrained into the Middle-earth story.
It's all carefully worked out. There's nothing arbitrary about the names in Tolkien's writings. So you kind of reconstruct the language, and then you reconstruct the mythology and the worldview that goes with it. And this is the way his imagination worked.
In 1915, Tolkien would graduate from Oxford University with first-class honors to then marry the love of his life, Edith Bratt. But finding himself facing the catastrophic war that had gripped Europe, Tolkien would enlist as a signaling officer in the British Army.
This coincides with him actually going out to France for the initial period of the Battle of the Somme, and he sees the destruction and the desolation that happens there, and also the corpses and so on that have accumulated over those few weeks. He also learns that his schoolboy friends perish in the Battle of the Somme.
And Tolkien claimed that he became more interested in fairy tales during the war than he was before.
He contracts trench fever, he comes back in the latter part of 1916, and he actually spends the rest of the war back in England.
But when he was on leave with his wife, Edith, and she danced through some flowers, and that image of his beloved wife gave him the idea, which led to a story called Beren and Luthien, which also, Luthien is an elven maiden. And these kind of stories then, they're the backgrounds of the Lord of the Rings.
In the aftermath of the war, Tolkien would initially work at Oxford Dictionary, but eventually end up teaching English at Leeds University, where he would be its youngest professor.
In the case of a major text like Beowulf, he's teaching that to students, but at the same time engaging with it all the time.
MacDonald, Lewis, Tolkien, and all the others in between that we haven't mentioned, they were influenced by Beowulf.
Here now are landed, come from afar over the encircling sea, noblemen of the Geese, the chiefest of them men of arms named Beowulf.
Perhaps the most famous Old English poem that Tolkien was teaching to his students.
It's just a great classic story that is, in many ways, the foundation of Western literature.
So we don't know who wrote Beowulf. We know it was written down around about the year 1000. Early medieval literature is written down primarily by Christian monks, but even then they're writing tales down like Beowulf, which at first glance you think this has got absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. But in some cases like that text, it's trying to explore pre-Christian beliefs, heroic beliefs, pagan beliefs in a Christian period. And in that case you could use dragons and other monsters as symbols.
Holy God hath sent him to us in his mercy, even to the West Danes, against terror of Grendel, for the Maker had prescribed him with the race of Cain.
So Grendel is a descendant of Cain and Abel in the Bible. And Cain's curse is that he has to roam the earth outside of all human community, outside of all fellowship, because he murdered his brother.
Of him all evil broods were born, ogres and goblins and haunting shapes of hell, and the giants too that long time warred with God.
Ancient Anglo-Saxon narrative that happens in the real world also has this mythological and biblical backstory, so that the two worlds are somehow always in discourse with each other, always talking, always enlivening each other.
Therein went some nameless man, creeping in night the pagan treasure. His hand seized a goblet deep, bright with gems.
These ideas from Beowulf and other texts that he's reading begin eventually to bubble to the surface when he puts together a couple of stories, the stories being The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings.
He gave a lecture on Beowulf, which was very famous. It was called The Monsters and the Critics. That was eventually published, The Monsters and the Critics. And this was revolutionary in the study of Anglo-Saxon literature in the 1930s. And suddenly you realize that this man had another side to him as well as being simply a novelist, a very famous novelist, of course.
So Tolkien would speak of this whole spectrum as a literature of fairy, F-A. Fairy is just the realm of the fae, the realm of the fair folk. It's all the literature that touches upon that realm. So you can think of the spectrum in terms of the content, how present are we in our world, how present are we in the world of fairy tale. Or you might think of it in terms of the narrative voice. The mythic is sort of very high and distant, broad sweeps of time and civilization. You might say we may have stories about the gods that touch upon human lives, and those would be the great myths. The heroic romance, maybe have a big cast where the two worlds are more fully intermingled. But it's not covering centuries, it's covering months or years, and it's covering countries, not whole worlds. And then the fairy tale may last a day or 2 days, and it's about 1 or 2 people or 4 or 5 people in one little cottage in one little corner of the woods. Where the gods have a very brief side appearance, you might think of those as a lighthearted fairy tale. You can be sort of anywhere along that. You know, The Hobbit begins here as a lighthearted fairy tale, and by the end it sort of moved really close to the realm of heroic, of epic fantasy. And The Lord of the Rings is really solidly in this world of epic fantasy. You could speak of fantasy literature as that whole realm of fairy tale, heroic fantasy, and myth.
Tolkien would eventually find himself back at Oxford, where he would spend the rest of his career teaching the literature he loved. At the Eagle and Child, not far from the spires of Magdalen College, he and fellow professor Clive S. Lewis would create an informal group that would meet regularly for decades to come.
The Inklings really grew out of the friendship that Lewis and Tolkien had. It was their particular friendship, which other colleagues and friends would eventually cluster.
Drop in, sure. You like to drink, you like to smoke.
It was Lewis and Tolkien and Lewis's brother Warren and Charles Williams eventually and other Oxford colleagues and even Lewis's doctor, Humphrey Havard. Occasional visitors from London like Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson from Reading and others.
Charles Williams, I don't know, he was a talker. Lewis was a talker. Tolkien, when he got going, he was a real talker. I think you wouldn't go too often if you couldn't keep up.
They would meet usually twice a week during term time. Once in the pub, the Eagle and Child, and that was more sort of social and college gossip and college politics that they would talk. And then they would also meet on a Thursday night in Lewis's college rooms, and that was when they would share the manuscripts that they were working on, the books that they were writing. They would have these readings aloud and thrash out what they were working on and have this back and forth.
And these conversations that they have, these become books. These become ideas for books that they're working out. I mean, it's not like they're having, they are having fun. It's recreation for them, but it's really recreation, they're producing something through this conversation.
It's a famous tale. He was sitting in his study, marking exam papers, which he describes as an incredibly boring task, and he came across a blank page, which he thought was wonderful, because he didn't have to mark it. And he writes down in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and he's not entirely certain where this came from. And from that he starts to build these tales around Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves with his children.
And he writes it in the same style. What is a hobbit? Let me tell you what a hobbit is. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. It's not a nasty, smelly, wet, damp hole. It's a hobbit hole, and that means comfort.
Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful grey ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. Very pretty, said Gandalf. But I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure that I'm arranging.
And Gandalf, in a way, is the orchestrator of fantasy or adventure. And he deliberately sends him out of his comfort zone, back to this world, an ancient world, a world of heroes.
But it's quite clear he never intended that to be part of the Middle-earth mythology. But as he said, the two attracted each other, and gradually the story of Bilbo and the story of the quest becomes part of the Middle-earth story, and they just become entwined.
There he lay, a vast red golden dragon, and about him on all sides, stretching away across the unseen floors, lay countless piles of precious things.
The classic picture of a dragon that many gamers and geeks are familiar with. Dragon sitting on a hoard of wealth just because it makes it feel good. Think of Smaug. He can feel when one little coin is no longer under his belly.
Well, thief, I smell you, and I feel your air. Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality. O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities, replied Bilbo.
A thief who breaks into a dragon's den and steals a cup. This is the kind of story that you get in the heroic poem Beowulf.
You know, he drew on a couple of important dragons from ancient myth, you know, the Fafnir dragon, as well as the Beowulf dragon. But now no one can write about dragons without also being influenced by Smaug.
In today's world, we have this thing called fan fiction. It's not a new concept. If you go back and look at the history of it, there are people that did this all the time. They built off of one another's ideas, and they had no problem with it. Nobody was charging them with plagiarism.
Murderers and elf friends, the great goblin shouted. Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes.
Tolkien's goblins in The Hobbit, by Tolkien's own admission, were lifted right out of The Princess and the Goblin. That was his imaginative influence.
Tolkien had not only read MacDonald, he'd read everything that MacDonald had read, and he'd read more than MacDonald had read. MacDonald's ideas are also old myths retold. They're part, as Tolkien would say, of the tale, the Tree of Tales. The Tree of Tales has many branches and many leaves, and everything in the end goes back to similar roots.
A children's story by the end of The Hobbit, and we get this kind of tragic confrontation between different peoples arguing about compensation and who does the money and the wealth belong to.
And when he gets back to the Shire, he's a very different hobbit. He's grown up.
Gandalf says to him, "You're not the hobbit you were," and he wasn't. And that's what I think, that's exactly what fantasy ought to do for us.
That they did, in fact, deeply influence one another, that they offered one another helpful criticism and critique, that they acted, as it were, enablers and resonators, but also formers and shapers and conversation partners and critics, and actually had a material part to play in the creation of the great works that we now have.
The Hobbit would launch Tolkien as a serious writer of fantasy, but out of the very same Oxford group would be another, also destined for greatness.
Lewis himself said that one of the things that made him what he was the fact that he was on his own very often in an old house with nothing but books. And in effect, his imagination built on what he found in books.
When he was a boy and in his teens, he was reading Arthurian stuff. The Norse legends were a major influence. He describes them as having the most amazing hold over his imagination. But of course, he and his brother, he and Warnie, had made up stories between them for years when they were children. They had these entirely imaginative worlds that were very real to them in many ways.
His voraciousness in reading, I think, was partly assisted by his parents' huge collection of books and partly by the fact that his parents regarded the outdoors as terribly dangerous and the wet, especially the wet of Northern Ireland. I don't think there was any great argument that Lewis followed in order to become an atheist. It was just a case of his childhood faith drying up on him and him abandoning it. He was finding that his His religious practice as a young Christian was just a great burden to him, especially his prayers. Soon after Lewis's mother died, when he was about 10, he was sent abroad from Ireland, England, to be educated, and his father had managed to choose possibly the very worst school in the whole of England. It was a terrible school, presided over by this lunatic headmaster. I mean, he was actually certifiably insane, and he was eventually certified, and he died in an asylum. He was eventually assigned to a private tutor, William Kirkpatrick, who they nicknamed the Great Knock. Kirkpatrick was an ultra-logical rationalist who really put a sort of backbone into Lewis's thinking habits and required him to defend everything he said with evidence and examples. And Lewis found this very nourishing. He said that some boys would have collapsed under the pressure, but to him it was like red meat and strong beer. He thrived on it.
The young Lewis was a decided atheist, but a struggle between his rational thinking and imagination would begin to open the door of another possibility.
Lewis tells a really interesting story about the effect of reading MacDonald on him, and it's the kind of most important of a series of little epiphanies that he describes in his book, Surprised by Joy, is picking up at random from a railway station, second-hand bookstore, a copy of George MacDonald's Fantastes, sitting on a train and reading it, and being completely entranced by it, as though there were a kind of light in the book and changes the railway carriage. He's been reading about enchanted woods and valleys and streams, and he looks out through the railway windows at these kind of woods and streams, and suddenly they're a bit more enchanted. And afterwards, he's looking back, he realizes it was holiness.
It was like his mind was blown open. That in effect he suddenly felt, and I use that word deliberately, he felt the presence of something enormously significant which he'd never really experienced before.
He sums it up just beautifully. He says, I suppose in a way my imagination was baptized before I was. And the rest of me took a bit of time to catch up.
What he recognizes in Fantastes is a call to be imaginative about goodness and to recognize, and later he looks back and understands this as recognize that God, in his goodness, is a God of imagination.
We don't see religion in MacDonald's fairy tales the way we would, see them in a modern work of theology. Just like we don't see religion very much in Tolkien's writing either. They're deeply theological, deeply philosophical, deeply spiritual, deeply theistic, but not religious. So it could kind of slip past the radar of at that point, an atheist rationalist C.S. Lewis.
I think that made Lewis realize that here was a genre, here was a way of doing things, a way of telling things that actually spoke at a deeper level than anything he'd known up to that point.
Lewis's wartime experience was relatively brief. It was only about 6 months. And some of that 6 months was actually spent in a field hospital when he went down with trench fever. But he certainly witnessed plenty of horrors, and he talks in Surprised by Joy about how he became very familiar with the very old and the very recent dead. He saw sitting and standing corpses, a landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass. I think Lewis and his brother, and Tolkien to a certain extent, were, they suffered, of course. There were difficult memories to cope with. It was a kind of trauma, but it wasn't so traumatizing as to leave them absolutely incapable of performing a responsible and regular life.
Post-war, Lewis would attend Oxford University, becoming a fellow and tutor in English literature. Eventually, two Inklings would have a profound impact on Lewis with a simple walk.
He's walking along, innocently having this conversation with Tolkien and Dyson, and the subject turns to Christianity, and Lewis says the kind of classic sneering Oxford atheist philosopher thing, where you go, oh, come on. Tolkien says, how can you be so reductive about that event as a piece of history, and it means nothing to you? And yet, the great myths of death and resurrection moves you to tears. And Lewis says, yes, because it's myth, it's great, it's resonance, but alas, it's not true. Myths are lies, even though they are lies breathed through silver. And Tolkien says, no, they're not.
And Tolkien and Dyson said, well, stop thinking about Christianity in terms of doctrines. Think about it more as a story, as a sequence of events, of characters and drama. Think of it, in other words, like you think of the pagan myths that you have enjoyed so much throughout your life.
That the word myth does not mean false. What makes it a myth is that it continues to be told throughout time in different cultures, different people, and continues to be a powerful story.
But Christianity has a historical claim to it, so you can say that Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate, just outside Jerusalem, roughly in the year AD 33. So you can locate it, you can place it.
And J.R.R. Tolkien helped Lewis to see that Christianity told a story about how the world began, about why it went wrong, about what could be done to put it right again.
And you can see, as it were, the two halves of Lewis's mind trembling, and what reconciles them is Christ.
He realized that Christianity is much better understood as a myth, a true myth, the true myth.
The greatest myth is also the available and historical fact. Both sides of your mind, your reason and your imagination, can be fully satisfied by this.
That the stories people tell, the great imaginative projections human beings create about their situation, will, if the Christian story is true, will all converge on that sooner or later.
And he does say that the immediate human cause of his Christian conversion was that long nighttime conversation with Tolkien and Dyson.
If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning.
Many years later, it would be another conversation with Tolkien, who had just finished writing The Hobbit, that would spur the two on in a friendly challenge to bring the kinds of stories they loved to a modern audience. The two agreed that Tolkien would write a book about time, and Lewis would write about space.
Lewis was an atheist who became a Christian. But I think Lewis had a real interest in asking, how could I tell stories in ways that capture the imagination and at the same time convey what the Christian faith is all about?
Lewis does the sort of ultimate improbable mashup, because what he does is he takes the idea of space journey, which is all modern and high-tech, and then he says, I'm going to write about it as though the beautiful picture of the heavens that you get in Dante, which is also about journeying through the planets. He simply uses all that medieval material, subtly transformed, in his stories about Mars and Venus.
And it's a 17th century word, space. Before the 17th century, you would not have referred to the night sky as space. You would have called it the heavens that tell the glory of God.
But Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart. Now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance, how indeed it should be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come.
One of the central ideas is a challenge to the great kind of arrogant cliche of almost all science fiction up to that point, which is that we're the good guys and the horrible, squeaky, bulgy aliens are the bad guys, and there must be something intrinsically evil and they're coming to get us, you know. And of course, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was the archetype of that. When he has his wicked character Weston, he's standing there in a pith helmet, which was the very thing that the imperialist English wore, you know, when they were crushing other people's countries, and talking about how human beings have the right to trash Mars.
The success of Out of the Silent Planet would propel C.S. Lewis into the public eye. Professor Tolkien, however, would be left still working on his time travel story.
He writes a time travel book, he never publishes it. And he writes about a set of Oxford scholars in the 1980s, he's writing this in the 1940s, so he's thinking forward, who start to go back in time mentally, and they're going back through Anglo-Saxon period, all through English history, and they end up back in Middle-earth. And he begins to play around with this entire concept that this is all one world. And even towards the end of his life, he keeps saying, Middle-earth, this is our Earth, this is our planet.
While Lewis would eventually complete an entire trilogy based on space, Professor Tolkien would instead find himself being pulled back into Middle-earth in the wake of the success of The Hobbit.
They wanted a sequel. So he started to write a sequel. By the end of the year 1937, he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do with it. And by that stage, he'd decided that fairy tales were not simply for children. He'd given a fairly famous lecture at the University of St. Andrews on fairy tales. And he was beginning to realize that the fairy tales are the old myths, if you like, being retold in a certain style, in a folk tale style.
Tolkien felt that the Anglo-Saxon and Viking roots of our culture had been seriously trashed and overlaid by the Norman invasion, the French invasion in 1066, and that England had, in a sense, lost its epic and had gone in for French and then Greek and Latin versions of things when we had perfectly good myths and legends of our own. And in a sense, he wanted to write a new epic.
You can't write a long narrative poem because it will only reach a specialist audience, so he wrote a novel instead.
Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. But he had no close friends, until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favourite, was young Frodo Baggins.
It starts with a character like Bilbo and then his nephew Frodo, who, in some ways, even though they're supposed to be hobbits, and hobbits are different to human beings because they have hair on their feet and they're not very tall, but in some ways you forget that as you're reading it, and they just seem to be ordinary, everyday people living in some kind of rural village, and it's difficult to put a time to it, 1800 or something like that.
The life that a lot of readers can much more closely associate with, and enters into this heroic realm of Middle-earth. And he encounters characters like Elrond and Galadriel, who are characters right out of fantasy, right out of myth.
Rooted in medieval literature and medieval languages and Tolkien's own invented languages. And that is the way, I suppose, that you do an epic which will appeal to a wider audience in the 20th century.
One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them.
But the ring in some ways is quite different, very modern, it's very addictive. There are not many addicts in medieval literature, but the ring creates a kind of addiction, an addiction to power and power over other people.
The Magic Ring by the Baron de la Motte Fouquet, it was almost extinct as a book. There were less than 6 copies in libraries across the world. In 1813, a huge international sensation. There were cosplayers in costume dressing up like the main characters of the novel, and it's very much a missing link if you look at sort of magic ring literature that would end up producing Tolkien. One of the little ways that slipped into later understandings of the genre was because MacDonald quotes the magic ring in one of his own novels as the beginning of one of the chapters. In his way, an archivist, a historian, and preservationist of this, as much as he was a transformational character in moving the genre on to what it would become in the 20th century.
Now, MacDonald drew on some of those roots as well, but really Tolkien was going, in a sense, not only drawing from MacDonald, but drawing much more deeply than even MacDonald did from the sources to which MacDonald had gone.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie.
So Tolkien himself was a devout Catholic. He does play around with religion, of course, but it's not really explicit in his book. The sort of suffering of Frodo, you can marry that to the Christ's suffering, the Passion. You know, he's literally had to be carried up Mount Doom at the end. So there are all kinds of ideas and images there. But to Tolkien, fantasy was something a lot bigger than that. What he is doing is he's using fantasy as a way of exposing what he believes the true message of Christianity was. In this case, that ultimately good will conquer evil.
The idea that there is good and evil and these are not arbitrary human-made or cultural-made constructs, but they are inherent in the creation of the universe. But the universe being the creation of a good and loving, creative being. Tolkien names him Eru Iluvatar. Eru means the one, Iluvatar means father of all, the source of all life, the source of all existence. That creation myth is central.
He has these turning points in his book, which he calls eucatastrophic moments, where you suddenly get this glimpse of good winning out. And he says that is me, as what he would term a sub-creator, showing you that good will win out.
Most importantly, that consolation of the eucatastrophe. The idea that you have a beautiful, happy ending that is more poignant than grief. And when you see that, you have a glimpse of truth with big T, right?
The ultimate fantasy tale, and he doesn't mean this as in it's made up, as in he means it exposes something which spiritually realistic books can't read, is in the New Testament, where you see the ultimate victory of Christ.
Lord of the Rings was read there. And you don't get that book without the Inklings, without the actual group. Where Lewis was the only, I mean, he would criticize, he would suggest things to Tolkien, but he was an enthusiastic reader and an intelligent reader. And Tolkien get bogged down too. He was a very slow writer, very methodical, unlike Lewis. Completely the opposite. Lewis was very fast. He could write a draft of a book, one take, sit down and write it.
While Professor Tolkien would continue to work through his epic, The Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis was now becoming known for both his fiction and non-fiction writings, including the space novel that had developed into a trilogy. But another world war would grip England. Lewis, also known for his Christian writings, would be called to serve his nation.
Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. And many people read that and thought, this is really clear. And some people at the BBC thought we might use this man to do some radio broadcasts to talk about the relevance of Christianity in the Second World War.
Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, submit with every fiber of your being, and you'll find eternal life.
There was no overarching theme to begin with. The series just grew sort of incrementally, and eventually Lewis collected them all under one title, which he called Mere Christianity in 1952. And it has become one of Lewis's most popular, most successful works.
In the midst of writing science fiction, broadcasting on the BBC, and teaching at Oxford, Lewis's imagination would lead him to creating another fictional book with a very unlikely inspiration.
It was inspired partly by listening to Adolf Hitler on the radio and thinking for a moment how plausible, how persuasive this man sounds, how convinced he seems to be of his own position. And the next morning, when Lewis was in church on a Sunday morning, the idea for the Screwtape Letters came to him. Let's think about how the devil, how Satan himself is so very convincing.
Of, in effect, seeing it in a completely different perspective. In other words, instead of saying, look, you're a Christian, behave like this, he's saying, imagine there's a devil there trying to tempt you. What strategies might the devil use?
My dear Wormwood, you say you are delirious with joy because the European humans have started another of their wars. But what permanent good does it do us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? The safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
His friends at Magdalen College, Oxford, were not pleased with him because they felt this was academically trivial. But actually it was the book that in many ways propelled Lewis to fame. People just found this so original, so exciting, that they in effect began to see him as the new guide to the Christian faith.
I think the sense of apocalyptic conflict, the sense of facing evil, the sense of really being driven back to what values you would die for, was quite strong in the Second World War. And of course the revelations about the death camps at the end of the war just laid out that reality of evil as never before in many people's imaginations.
They had a very strong sense that the modern world had taken a bad turn, and they saw themselves as countercultural, very much so, and deliberately, Tolkien and Lewis deciding to write the kind of stories they would have liked to have read. And they saw themselves as standing against certain major currents in the contemporary world at the time.
Lewis had now found fame on both sides of the ocean with his theological and fictional writings. But in 1948, while Tolkien was still revising and reworking his great fantasy novel, Lewis was about to undertake his own great subcreation and write a children's novel.
I think we should take really seriously what Lewis says, that it all started with a picture.
Was that image that had come into his mind in his mid-teens of the faun carrying an umbrella walking through a snowy wood. And he developed that into a story, possibly because Tolkien and MacDonald were already doing it. And that sort of gave him permission to do it alongside all his scholarly work. And he found he was rather good at it.
This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hands. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold.
Were the children go through this strange wardrobe and feel the chill as they enter this mysterious world and begin to discover what it is. And that's that sense of crossing a threshold.
I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, how have you come into Narnia? Narnia? What's that, said Lucy. This is the land of Narnia, said the faun.
The line of wits in the wardrobe isn't an allegory, as if everything corresponds to some spiritual truth. It's what Lewis called a supposal. Supposing this were true, how would this work out?
The way I've sometimes put it is that Lewis wants to give people who may not have encountered Christianity except in a rather attenuated Sunday school form, he wants to give people a sense of why it might matter and how it might matter.
To steal past watchful dragons of religious inhibition, as he calls it, and to cast Christianity into an imaginative space so that you could respond to it emotionally without any feeling of obligation.
Sees your deepest imaginative powers and invites you to see the truth as an adventure.
And he says eventually Aslan came bounding into this and pulled the whole thing together.
They say Aslan is on the move, perhaps has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different.
He describes the way they feel. There's a sense there is something very special, very wonderful, almost noble about Aslan, which transcends any category they've known.
Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer.
Character's authority and dignity, he's the king, but also a sense of the character's approachability, because he's beautiful and he's got this strokable mane and these beautiful eyes, and he will romp and frisk with you like a giant cat. So for Lewis, the idea of a regal lion who was nonetheless playful was a great symbol, imaginatively speaking, of God, who is the almighty ruler of the universe, but also our Father.
Now, I think that's a mythopoeic moment, to borrow the phrase that they like to use. I know Lewis is sometimes accused, and Tolkien was one of the people who accused him of being a bit sort of mechanical about this is this, and this is this, and here's my allegory. But I don't think that's how it started, and I think all the best of Narnia is sheer welling up from within of a deep creativity.
Not in a dry sermon, but in an imaginative universe of dragons and elves and fairies. That's why children and young adults, and their parents for that matter, read their stories again and again.
In the Narnia tales, I've often thought that the wardrobe, since it opens like a book does, I've often thought that the wardrobe itself is really a wonderful symbol of imagination. If you think about what happens to the kids, they go in there, usually learning something quite profound about themselves, and then they come back. Some of them aren't changed in the real world, so some of them have to go back a couple of times. It's going into the world of imagination, learning something about ourselves.
As the worlds of Narnia and Middle-earth moved closer to completion, the Inklings group that had invigorated the two writers' imaginations for decades had come to an end. Charles Williams had unexpectedly passed away in 1945, and Tolkien, feeling resistance to any more stories about elves, had simply stopped reading The Lord of the Rings during the meetings. Lewis's brother Warnie would record in his diary of October 1949 that nobody came.
It was from those Thursday night meetings that Screwtape Letters arose, and The Lord of the Rings, and it was a really fruitful, productive group.
Losing Williams was a bit of a blow. I think that was one of the first things. And I think that Tolkien and Lewis drifted apart for whatever reason, and we don't know.
Tolkien wanted a myth to be something like one of the great Anglo-Saxon legends. And of course, when you read The Lord of the Rings, I mean, that's what you get. But Lewis wanted to do it his own way, because he realized this would capture the imagination of children. Whereas, of course, The Lord of the Ring captures the imagination of adults.
Tolkien was a man who, before he wrote the books, he prepared a backstory. He wrote a language. In gamer terms, he created the whole setting before he told the first story. You read the Narnia books, you know that C.S. Lewis was making up some of it as he went. The order in which they were written is not the order they recommend you read them in now. And so that probably annoyed Tolkien as well, as C.S. Lewis is very blunt and very in your face. Tolkien, he just tells the story and expects the grace to just flow through it.
When we want to tell a story, we use the only medium available to us, which is language. Language is the thing we can make up and create with and manipulate, and we're briefly godlike, if you like, when we make up a story in language. We are the creator of our linguistic world, yes? But God is God. So he can use time and space and matter and real people to tell his story. So Tolkien then begins to put into his stories the very idea given to his characters at the worst moment, that they're in a story. So if you think about the terrible moment when they're nearly about to give up, when Frodo and Sam, are at the worst point, and they suddenly think, well, maybe we're in a story, and Sam says, the characters in the stories used to be like this.
What a tale we've been in, Mr. Frodo, haven't we? He said. I wish I could hear it told. And I wonder how it will go on after our part.
In the very act of seeing themselves as being told, they're given courage.
It's one of the most valuable things you can give a kid. It's the perspective that when things look horrible, there are stories where things look horrible. And the only way you lose is by quitting. The only way to guarantee is to quit. And what it does is I think it gives them all kinds of emotional, psychological resources. I think that's one of the most important things that this fantasy does for kids.
Are you angry with me, Gandalf? He said. I did the best I could. You did indeed, said Gandalf, laughing suddenly, and he came and stood beside Pippin, putting his arm about the hobbit's shoulders and gazing out of the window.
Situation of the world, right? The situation of Middle-earth, of Gondor, of Minas Tirith, of the quest of Frodo and Sam is just filling him with care and sorrow. All of the circumstances of the world would seem to be hopeless.
Yet in the wizard's face he saw at first only lines of care and sorrow. though as he looked more intently, he perceived that under all there was a great joy, a fountain of mirth, enough to set a kingdom laughing were it to gush forth.
In the hope that Gandalf is able to have is because he can see the physical world, but he can also see the spiritual world. And I think this is what fantasy literature opens up our eyes to, is that there is more than just the laws of physics. There is more than just the material world. The material world is good and important and valuable. We should care about it, caring for creation, caring for other humans. But that care comes out of and flows into the recognition that it is part of a broader world.
1954 would see The Fellowship of the Ring, the first book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, finally published. Lewis was already on his 5th installment of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Horse and His Boy. But for all the prolific writing and publishing that Lewis was doing, both theological, academic, and fantastical, Oxford University had still not given him a full professorship.
Because he was so busy writing popular books, Lewis didn't write many academic books, and his academic colleagues weren't happy about this. And they began to think that Lewis had degenerated into a popular writer and had lost his academic credential.
I think there was no doubt that there was a resistance to his robust Christian apologetics. There was a place for a kind of decorous Christianity in Oxford, but as long as it kind of kept its place and stayed in the chapel.
While the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis had somewhat waned, Tolkien would be instrumental in getting Lewis the newly founded chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College, Cambridge. Lewis would now divide his time between his Oxford home and Cambridge position. The 7th book of Narnia would be published in 1956, and the series would become a best-selling classic. Warney, with the house typewriter, would spend his time responding to fans on behalf of his brother.
Some parents of children wrote to Lewis he had made the stories too frightening. He thought that the children themselves would relish the opportunity to see a world in which moral choices matter and in which dangers are real. Because children are not stupid, and children know that the real world is like that moral choices matter and dangers are real. And why should a story be any different? Risk and threat and indeed death and battle in these stories, but it's always within the context of a larger loving purpose.
Late in life, Lewis would marry to American writer Joy Davidman. Davidman, a dear friend and intellectual companion, sadly would die of cancer only a few years later, leaving Lewis overwhelmed with grief. The great Clive Staples Lewis would pass away at his home in Oxford in 1963. Over a dozen essays and books, including a sequel to the Screwtape Letters, would eventually be published posthumously. While the legacy of C.S. Lewis would include his academic, theological, and other works of fiction, Narnia would be his most celebrated. Tolkien, who had begun imagining Middle-earth as a young man, would continue working on his mythology. In 1967, he would be asked to write a preface to another famous fairy tale, The Golden Key.
I think he had some criticisms of George MacDonald and the way George MacDonald carried out his vision. And he found that the best way to both express what George MacDonald accomplished that was really good and valuable, but also maybe how it could have been better or how it's been misinterpreted or misused, was not in the form of an essay, but in the form of his own fairy tale.
The Smith of Wootton Major would be the final story Tolkien would publish. He was now not only famous, but the Lord of the Rings had become successful beyond his imagination.
Popularity of the books in Middle-earth blew up in the 60s.
There were magazines saying, you can't go to college without a pair of sneakers and a copy of The Lord of the Rings, right? It was youth culture, it was a cultural phenomenon.
One of the great novels of the 20th century, which still seems to have its appeal to men and women, boys and girls in the 21st century.
The Lord of the Rings was sought after by film and television, and in 1969, Tolkien would sell the rights over to United Artists. After the death of his beloved Edith, J.R.R. Tolkien would return to live in an apartment at Merton College in Oxford. He would pass away in 1973 while still working on his original Middle-earth mythology, eventually to be published as the Silmarillion.
It's ironic he'd started writing that to a certain degree in the 1910s, but he still hadn't finished it by the time of his death in the 1970s. So the Silmarillion that we get in 1977 is edited by his son Christopher Tolkien. And it's his view in an attempt to make sense, and a very good attempt, I should say, to make sense from his father's writings.
Without Tolkien, the whole high fantasy, tradition that we have today is not there. You can't do high fantasy today without being in debt to Tolkien. He did it, and he did it the best, but he did it because of his scholarship, I think, because he was a historian, philologist.
Attempts to bring both Middle-earth and Narnia to television and film would continue in the decades after the passing of Lewis and Tolkien, but it would be Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings in 2001 that put fantasy into the mainstream. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, along with 2 other books from Narnia, would follow onto the big screen. And while the name George MacDonald in the 20th century remains in relative obscurity, the newfound celebrity of Tolkien, Lewis, and the Inklings has brought new academic attention to the 19th century Scottish minister turned fantasy writer.
Certainly when I started out MacDonald Scholarship, I could name on my fingers the MacDonald scholars that existed. And now there are hundreds of up-and-coming young scholars that are reading MacDonald, engaging with him.
While Tolkien, Lewis, and MacDonald are long gone, their works continue to engage and inspire readers to this day, not to mention inspire writers that have come after. One Scottish writer in particular has taken the genre to unimaginable heights.
A lot of young people today will only be familiar with Tolkien through the movies. They won't even have read it. But they'll all have grown up reading the Harry Potter stories.
I can think of several conversations at a deep level with students that I've had and talked about Harry Potter and Gryffindor and Slytherin, and like they've immediately gone, oh yeah, I get that totally,
Recently I was asked by actually a Sunday school group of teenagers to identify some of the Christian mythological symbols that were in there, because that was a new concept to them. I spent a couple days preparing for this, and it was a really good exercise for me as an academic. She talks about how Narnia shapes her writing, but she's going deeper. She's going into real old academic literature, drawing upon that as actually a lot of what I've been saying for years about MacDonald, Tolkien, Lewis being academic scholars, about their deep knowledge of story, about their choice to take story from the past and re-engage with it in new ways and draw together new stories that are made rich by the imaginations of the past. These antiphonal stories is exactly what Rowling's been doing.
The inscription on the headstone of James and Lily Potter. 1 Corinthians 15:26. The last enemy that will be defeated is death. In 2007, J.K. Rowling told Time magazine that sums up the entire Harry Potter series, and that deathlessness is a spiritual one. There is immortality, but it isn't achieved by trying to preserve the self. Rowling is holding up people who gave their lives out of love, right? Who sacrificed themselves.
In all these stories, the mistake might be to think that magic is just about how you manipulate the powers of the universe more effectively. And yet, even in J.K. Rowling, if you read her carefully, there's a great deal more than that going on. Of course, you get a long way with magical manipulation. But at the end of the day, what really makes the difference, again and again, it's love, it's sacrifice, it's loyalty. And that's a deeply theologically rooted theme for all of them.
It's those big questions that make these books so transformational. Fantasy steeped in imagination, framed by theology.
They believed again in the imagination. Stories are the way we understand the world, but also a way we understand the world we can imagine as well as the world we've got.
They really are. And both Lewis and Tolkien are in effect saying, we're telling you our stories as a way of unlocking your soul.
I think that living in and from a great, what C.S. Lewis famously called a true myth, gave the chance for people who lived in that to be myth makers in a true way.
Lewis and Tolkien, as great storytellers, as great poets, great makers of myth, were the unacknowledged legislators of the middle of the 20th century. It was not always recognised at the time how important they were, but the fact that 50, 60, 70 years on they're still being read just as much, and in many cases more than they were at the time, shows that they really have tapped into something true, good and beautiful.
Why did it wane? Why is this a huge response again? Is it because, like MacDonald thought, that people were losing their sense of identity, losing their story? Is that what we're seeing again?
Some crazy philosopher said 2,000 years ago, come to me like a little child. And he said childish, open nature to embrace and to explore. And if we lose that as an adult, my God, that's when we lose our imagination.